Ever wonder how the Himalayan stacks up against the Honda XR650L or the Kawasaki KLR650? Come on along, and we'll dive in and figure it out. Make sure to stay to the end to find out what my estimation of the best beginner bike is of the bunch. If you don't already know, the Royal Enfield Himalayan is my personal bike. The reason I'm comparing it to the Honda XR650L is because I actually used to own one, and I do have some experience on it, on trails and on the road. I threw the Kawasaki KLR650 in because honestly, it comes up in many conversations relating to the Himalayan, so I thought it would just make sense for us to throw those specs out there as well. In fact, on some websites, it's listed as a direct competitor to the XR. Let's dig into the specs and see what we come up with. Just one more thing. If you find value in this video, slap a like on it, consider subscribing. Have you ever heard of people that order at a restaurant from the right side of the menu to the left side? And this is in the US, so that's backwards from how we normally read, in case you're wondering. Right, you get it. You scroll down, look at the price. Oh, that's what I want. That looks great. It's a thing. And at times in my life, I've done it. We all have. I'm not going to make you any food. We're not going to demo my latest burger recipe or anything like that. But to discount the importance of price would be silly. So let's start there. The Himalayan comes in with the lowest price point for the 2023 model of $54.99. The Honda XR650L comes in at $69.99. Now the Kawasaki KLR comes in at a beginning price point of $68.99, but will go up to $81.99 depending on which model you get and which options you get, whether you go from the base model to the Adventure and then throw in ABS on top of that. So they've got a lot broader range. I want everybody to keep in mind what my personal goal is with this channel. That is, I want as many people as possible to get outside and ride. I would love for everybody to ride on trails, but it doesn't matter. Anything that you're doing on two wheels, even if it's a mountain bike, is totally cool. Just get outside and enjoy it. There's so much cool stuff to see out there. Next is displacement. Displacement for the Himalayan comes in at a stunning 411 cc's. The Honda XR comes in at 644 cc's, and the Kawasaki KLR comes in winning the title of this round at 652 cc's. Theoretically, the higher the displacement of the engine, the more potential for power there is. We'll see if that holds to be true. Both the Himalayan and the Honda are air-cooled. The KLR is liquid-cooled. The difference between those two? Liquid-cooled engines will run at a more consistent temperature. There won't be as much expanding and contracting because the heat doesn't fluctuate as much. It allows for tighter tolerances on those engines, again, potentially producing more power. Another thing it does add is a little bit of complexity to the engine. It's another hose, it's a whole other component that potentially can break. So we just talked about engine power in the last 2 points. Based on what we've talked about, who do you think is going to win the horsepower race in this? Okay, I'm not going to make you wait any longer. The Himalayan has 24.3 horsepower. The XR has 43.6 horsepower. The Kawasaki has 34.6. Huh. What happened? So we are talking about dual sport motorcycles. We're talking about adventure motorcycles that have the ability to go both on the road and off-road. So whenever you're going off-road, the more important number is not the horsepower, it's the torque. So at low speeds, you can roll up those hills and over those obstacles. So where are we? The Himalayan, 23.6 foot-pounds of torque. The Honda has 38.2 foot-pounds of torque, and the KLR has 39.1 foot-pounds of torque. The winner here, the KLR. So we already talked about the accessibility of these motorcycles in relation to price point. But how about physical accessibility? Which one is the easiest to manage? I'm talking about seat height here. The Honda has a 37-inch seat height. The KLR has 34.3-inch seat height. The Himalayan comes in at the lowest, most accessible seat height at 31.5. Seat height leads us very nicely into ground clearance. If you're going across bumps and rocks and roots and stuff, how much ground clearance is there for you to be able to get across these obstacles? I don't like to call them obstacles, I like to call them fun bumps. We're going to start out with the Honda here because it's got an impressive 13 inches of ground clearance. That's partly the cause for the higher seat height, but wow, That's huge. The Himalayan has 8.6 inches and the KLR has 8.3. Now we are talking about going off-road. I assume if you're watching this video about dual sport / adventure touring motorcycles, that is a goal at some point. I highly encourage it. Do it. The wheelbase of the XR is 57.3 inches. The wheelbase of the Himalayan is 58, and the KLR rounds it out at 60 inches. So the benefit of having a shorter wheelbase is it's more flickable, it's more maneuverable, it's easier to get around that hairpin turn a lot faster. A longer wheelbase will give you a more plush, stable ride. Depending on what kind of riding you're going to do, I'm going to let you decide which one wins this. Because it's all about what you're going to do. It's your opinion that matters. Fuel capacity. The KLR holds 6.1 gallons of fuel. The Himalayan holds 4 gallons of fuel. The Honda XR650L holds 2.8 gallons of fuel. Kind of like a Sportster. So if you're going to ride long distances, especially if you're going to be touring out on the road and going for long distances, or you know what, if you're riding longer trails where there are no gas stations, obviously fuel capacity is important. But that's not the only factor that's really going to affect your trip. Not only is the fuel capacity important, but how much the bike uses in miles per gallon is just as important to determining the longevity of your ride before having to refuel. So the gas mileage for the Himalayan is not really on the manufacturer's website. There's a lot of people that have field tested it, and the ranges are from 60 up to 80. So we'll just go with an average and say it's about 70 miles per gallon. Obviously, that's going to give you a range of 280 miles. The gas mileage for the Honda is 52 miles per gallon, so that's going to give you about a 145 mile range to empty. The MPG for the KLR is 49, so 6.1 gallons, about 298 miles. Obviously, the mile per gallon that you're going to achieve depends on what kind of riding you're doing. If you're going at 90 miles an hour on the freeway, well, the Himalayan can't really do that in its stock configuration. But if somehow or another you get these bikes to go 90 miles an hour on the freeway, it's going to suck a lot of gas. If you're going uphill, over rocks, it's going to suck more gas. So that's obviously a consideration. One good factor about this, both the Himalayan and the KLR have fuel gauges, so you'll be able to see it. The Honda, you can get a fuel gauge and add it to it, or you can just learn your tank. Now, a lot of people will actually buy extended tanks for the Honda. I did. And they cost me about $250. So that'll give you a lot more extended range out of it if you do that. A Service, Clark makes them. So we have a heavyweight winner here. The KLR comes in at 460 pounds. The Himalayan comes in at right about 440 pounds. And the XR, 348 pounds. The XR is the lightest by far. Obviously, it's going to make a difference if you're riding on a trail. Lower weight is very nice. If you're riding on the road, lower weight may or may not be nice, depending on who you're passing or riding beside. Both the Himalayan and the KLR have dual front piston calipers and single rear piston calipers. The rotors for the front are 300 millimeter and 240 millimeters in the back for both of those bikes. The XR has the same caliper configuration, but the rotors come in at 256 and 220 on the rear. The XR does not offer an option for ABS. The KLR, it's an option for about $300 depending on which package you choose. So the Himalayan does come with switchable ABS as well, whereas the KLR does not. Now the Honda has a compression damping front fork that is 43 millimeters versus the 41 millimeter telescoping forks for both the Himalayan and the KLR. So it's a bit beefier and a little more adjustability. All three of them have a single rear shock. The Honda has a Showa compression, rebound damping, and preload adjustment. The KLR comes with rebound damping and preload adjustment. The Himalayan only preload adjustment for the rear shock. All three of these have 5-speed transmissions. There's no overdrive amongst the lot. Now, here's my disclaimer. I have to admit that I haven't ridden the KLR off-road, and it was a long time ago. So to say that I can speak from experience about the way the KLR rides in its current iteration would not be honest. I can't. Like I said, we're throwing it in just because it comes up In many discussions, just about any dual sport or adventure touring discussion, the KLR makes its way in, so we're throwing in the specs for that. Now here's where the rubber hits the road. See what I did there? Let's chat about how the bikes perform while they're actually ridden, because ultimately that's really what's important. We're going to make some inferences about the KLR, but I already made my disclaimer. Now keep in mind, I still consider myself a new dual sport rider. Off-road is still new to me. I'm not a pro and I have no endorsements from any manufacturer whatsoever. Feel free and contact me if you want to talk. So my perceptions that I'm going to give you are from somebody that's coming from street riding to dual sport off-road riding, which is going to be closer to someone who has never ridden before as well. Hopefully that perspective is valuable. I think it is. I've said it before, if you've watched any of my other videos, my first ride on the Himalayan was underwhelming. It held straight line. It did just fine. But when I got up on the mountain passes going up, I struggled to maintain the speed limit. Now, I'm 6 foot, 215 now, not 220 like my original review of the Himalayan. Go in the right direction. But it was a little discouraging, considering I had just come from my Softail Deluxe, where it had torque to spare and double the horsepower, triple the horsepower actually of the Himalayan. Big difference. Overall, the bike was super manageable. I didn't have any issues, obviously, touching the ground. I could flat foot easily at the few stoplights that I did encounter on my way back home from the dealership. In the turns, I do have to admit that it didn't feel quite as planted as I wanted it to. I was in more of an upright, forward-leaning bike than my Softail, and I kind of wanted to take the turns a little faster. But it was not the experience that I wanted. Once I got home, I realized the rear wheel alignment was out just a little bit, so I adjusted that. I adjusted the preload and the sag for my weight, and I really haven't had that problem since. Amazingly, when I passed other vehicles or when they blew by me, I was expecting to feel a lot more buffeting and getting pushed around by the wind, but I really didn't feel that on the Himalayan. That was actually a good surprising point that happened on the ride back. So let's talk about the Honda. When I rode the Honda on the road, it felt like the Himalayan did before I made the adjustments and the turns. It was a little squirrely. Again, I think at that time I actually had a wide glide, but still it just wasn't as planted as I wanted it to be. And even going straight, I felt I was getting pushed around a lot more by the wind and other cars passing and cars that I passed. I think that just basically is because the 37-inch seat height absolutely has something to do with that. The ground clearance has something to do with that. The center of gravity is a bit higher. On the Honda, I did not have any issues at all maintaining the speed limit. So that was great. Now, if you look at the numbers, the KLR should do great out on the road. It's heavier. It's got more horsepower than the Himalayan. It should be able to get along stably and well. However, there is a lot of controversy around the adventure touring community about how effective it is at really riding at highway speeds, especially for long distances. If you want to see a good review on that, the Dork in the Road actually did a road test with his KLR, and he got it up to 80 miles an hour with not really any issues. All right, so let's talk about the trails. Well, the Himalayan felt pretty good on the trails. The stock C tires did well on rock and gravel. No issues there whatsoever. Now, if you watched any of my other videos, again, you can see that I have had some issues with mud and sand. Again, my opinion is that that's based on the fact that my tires are just not the right tires for that kind of material. And even though I haven't bottomed out the Himalayan yet, I can tell that I have a center stand. When we're going through some really rocky bits, I can tell that it's taxing this suspension. And again, 8.6 versus 13 on the Honda, huge difference, big difference. Some people have concerns about the Himalayan brakes. I think it's a matter of perspective. I've ridden 8 rides, about 180 miles, if my estimations are correct, off-road. Some of it kind of sketchy, some of it just dirt roads. But I haven't really ever felt the need to have more braking capacity. Maybe that's where I'm coming from. Maybe other people are coming from a bike that has super snappy and responsive brakes, but that's just my experience. Now, the XR is no doubt built way more for off-road riding than either of the other two bikes. When I was riding the Honda, I never felt like I was pushing it to its limits. In fact, I felt like my skills didn't maximize the potential of the Honda. I was a beginner. So keep in mind, this suspension is meant to keep the tires in contact with the road and also to keep the rider planted on the seat and absorb some of those bumps so you don't buck them off, right? The customization of the Honda really helps out with that. The clearance, 13 inches, that helps too. However, as a new off-roader, I found out that when I was going up a really kind of hairy off-road four-wheel drive trail with big rocks and ruts and washed out areas, I really had to time my stops because I needed stops, first of all. But I really had to time them so that I could get my foot down right. In fact, at one point, I actually misjudged and slowly laid the bike down. It was a slow death, but it happened. That was a little frustrating. I had to roll it back down the hill and then restart to go back up the trail. Now, granted, I was trying to learn this whole thing in the collegiate piece outside of Buena Vista, Colorado, with the highest concentration of 14ers in the state. So that was probably partially my fault as well. If we go to the paper and look at the KLR, there's really nothing that the KLR's got that's going to give it an advantage over the Himalayan, except for it's got more torque. Now, the seat height is higher. That could be a disadvantage. There's a little bit less ground clearance, 0.3 inches, not a ton. And a lot of people do say that the KLR feels a bit top heavy. Part of that comes from the 21 additional pounds it's carrying over the Himalayan, right? So that could be a challenge off-road. Before I get into which one of these I think is the best beginner bike, if you found any value in this video, slap a like on it. Consider subscribing. I can't wait to share summer with you. If you look up the Honda XR650L, there are some people out there that say it's a great beginner's bike. Well, I'm going to have to respectfully disagree with that. Now, keep in mind, if you're coming from dirt bike, motocross, off-road riding, going to the XR probably would be just great if that's kind of riding that you're going to do, and you want to be able to get around the streets as well. Don't get me wrong. I think that's perfectly reasonable. However, if you're coming from street to off-road, or you're coming from not riding to riding the XR, I think there's probably some better options out there for you. The XR is a beast in my opinion. Its capability far outweighed my skills. And the challenge of the seat height was the primary reason that I feel like I had such a hard time with it. Even though I had ridden motorcycles quite a bit and I have mountain biked quite a bit, so I know how to pick a line. The KLR, on the other hand, has many reviews out there and lots of questions about how good is the KLR on-road? Will it work? How good is the KLR off-road? Will it work? The general consensus is with the KLR that if you're going to go on the road, maybe you don't want to do a cross-country tour, even though some people have. And if you're going to go off-road, maybe you stick to dirt roads and milder trails, probably similar to what people would say about the Himalayan. So maybe the KLR is a pretty decent beginner bike. The one thing that I would caution anybody against is just make sure that the ergonomics work for you. Make sure that you can feel comfortable with the size of the bike. So much of this is really based on you. So how about the Himalayan? Just because I own one doesn't mean that I'm going to blindly endorse and say it's the perfect beginner bike, because it really depends on a lot of things. With any bike, you have to really think honestly about what you're going to use it for. What kind of riding are you going to do? What kind of terrain are you going to go on? If you're going to be primarily dirt oriented, then something like the XR is probably going to be better for you. Maybe you want to consider the new CRF300L. But think about this. The price range is very similar to the Himalayan in the mid 5,000 range, but the seat height is still 34.7 inches. So make sure that you go out and try whatever bike it is that you're going to buy. If you're primarily going to be on the highway and you've got the height to be able to ride the KLR conveniently and comfortably, then maybe that's what you want to go with, because it does have a higher horsepower, higher torque. It's got a bigger fuel tank, gives you a little bit more range, though not a lot because the gas mileage isn't as good as the Himalayan, but that might be the way you want to go. If you really want to be able to do both and you're a beginner, then my vote tends towards the Himalayan. I think you're just going to have a lot more comfort with the lower seat height. If you do want to go with the KLR, then you can get a lowering link kit that will reduce the seat height. It'll also reduce more of your clearance. So that's something to think about. That is a possibility. Now, granted, on the Himalayan, I haven't taken any super gnarly trails yet, but I have gone up some stuff that made me think. Let's just put it that way. Made me cautiously approach the obstacles that I was going over. And it did pretty well, with the exception of the sand and the mud. Oh, and there's the snow too. Snow's rough. Do your own research. Don't take anybody else's opinion as this is going to be the best for you, including mine. All I'm doing is throwing out observations from me. Definitely get out there, take this into consideration, whatever, store it in the back of your mind, but go out and do the research, sit on the bikes, ride the bikes, test drive them before you go out and buy them. Because you know what? Everybody's got opinions, but the only one that's actually important is yours. If you're curious about the Himalayan, my full review is going to be coming up top here, so you're welcome to take a look at that and see what I think a lot more in depth about the Himalayan specifically. I've not done one in depth on either of the other two bikes, like I said. If you have any questions, I will respond to the best of my ability. I'm not going to lie to you, so if I don't know something, I'm going to say I don't know. I do, however, usually research my answers ahead of time. And sometimes I'm able to find the answers, sometimes not. It just depends, but I'll totally be honest with you. Are any of these bikes bad motorcycles? Absolutely not. Whichever you choose, they are going to last. There are accessories galore for every one of these bikes out there. There's no doubt about that. If you want to get it, customize it, do your own thing, put on a lowering link, put on a bigger tank for the Honda, whatever it is, all that stuff is available. The KLR and the XR have both been around for a really long time. There's huge aftermarket available for them. The Himalayan itself has a pretty good size aftermarket. Parts are relatively inexpensive, so there's lots of customization opportunities for any of these bikes. Thanks for joining me on this. Be safe out there. And don't forget, get outside and ride. Well, we can ride.